Here are some lab instructions for Lab 15, igneous rocks. This will probably be broken into 2 or maybe even 3 parts because this is a pretty long lab and there's lots of things I'd like to tell you about. I'd like to start by looking at the pictures here on the very opening slide. These are all igneous rocks, but they're all different in a certain way. Well, actually, they're all different in a number of ways, but I'd like to start by looking at what you see in terms of the size of the minerals in each of these rocks. Each of these rocks formed from molten material cooling, either magma or lava. This one in the top here, this is known as obsidian, and this is actually a volcanic glass. And maybe it looks to you like glass. It's kind of shiny like glass, and this has absolutely no minerals in it. It still has atoms in it, like silicon and potassium and aluminum, things like that. But this cooled so quickly that there was no time for any minerals to form, and that's the definition of a glass. Remember, glass does not qualify as a mineral because of the fact that there is no crystalline structure, there's no mineral structure anywhere in that rock. Here's another igneous rock where it's difficult to see any particular minerals. There's some scratches sort of on the top of this rock, but those aren't minerals. You really can't see much in here. This is what we would call a fine-grained igneous rock. If you looked closely, or if you took a slide and looked under a microscope, you would actually see minerals, but they're very, very tiny. Over here we have sort of the other end of the spectrum with large minerals, large pink minerals, black minerals, glassy minerals, and sort of white minerals as well. This would be what we call a coarse-grained rock with large minerals. So we've got no minerals, tiny or fine minerals, and large minerals. Over here, we have a combination of these bottom two. We have large minerals, which are the white ones, and then the surrounding material, which we call a ground mass, is fine. So this is kind of a combination of a fine-grained material and a coarse-grained material. And so these are kind of the 4 types of what we call textures in igneous rocks. Here's the introductory page of your lab. And as it says here in the program objectives, we're going to be identifying common members of igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary rock families. Well, it says using a hand lens and pocket knife, but since we're doing this online, you're going to be doing it mostly by observing visually on videos. Hopefully you got a rock kit from PCC so you can at least look at some of this in your own hand with a hand lens. Let's make sure you understand what these 3 objectives are about before we even dig into the rest of the lab. The first one, because this one is focused on igneous rocks, says be able to identify the 3 types of igneous rock textures. Well, let's stop right there. What is an igneous rock texture and what are the 3 types? Well, texture refers to the size of minerals in geology. So I just showed you 4 different rocks. Some of them had large minerals, some of them had no minerals, some of them had small ones, some of them had combinations of sizes. Those are all referred to as textures. Rocks with coarse-grained minerals are one type, and the name we sometimes use for them is phaneritic. The fine-grained rocks are called sometimes aphanitic, although I'm happy if you just use coarse-grained and fine-grained. I don't think it's necessary at this stage in an introductory course to worry about these names, but you will see it throughout the lab, so you might as well know that that's what those words mean. Porphyritic is that type I showed you on the lower left that has large and small crystals. And then the glassy means no minerals at all. How does this relate to the conditions of rock formations? Well, it does, in fact, because minerals that grow in a slowly cooling magma have a lot of time to grow larger and larger. So slow cooling produces coarse-grained rocks. So if we have a rock that we can see has large crystals, we know it cooled slowly. On the other hand, if we have a rock where we can barely see the crystals because they're so tiny, we know it actually cooled very quickly and there was no time for those crystals to get large. Porphyritic rocks indicate 2 stages of cooling, a slow stage where some crystals were allowed to grow large, followed by a quick cooling stage where the rest of the ground mass cooled quickly. And then glassy indicates very quick cooling conditions. This is figure 4 from your lab. And it shows this idea of texture over here in this column. The first texture you're going to look at are the coarse-grained or phaneritic. And this entire row represents those rocks. Notice that the names in yellow are the ones that you're going to look at for this lab. I'm not going to ask you to learn all of these different names because I just don't think we have time. So you're going to be looking at coarse-grained rocks such as granite, diorite, gabbro, and peridotite. And we'll talk about the differences between them later, but right now they all have something in common, which is that they are all coarse-grained. They all have visible minerals. This row shows aphanitic or fine-grained rocks. We have a rhyolite, andesite, and basalt in this group. Then we have a glassy group, and obsidian is the only one we're going to look at in lab during this class. Notice that the phaneritic rocks correspond to intrusive or plutonic conditions, and you've already learned about this. This is the realm of igneous rocks where they cool slowly. Magma cools very slowly, and that's why the minerals can grow very large. Aphanitic and glassy igneous rocks form in extrusive or volcanic conditions. So we've gotten through this first little bullet. Coarse-grained rocks are intrusive. Fine-grained and glassy are extrusive. We didn't see porphyritic on that chart though. And that's because for our purposes in this class, we're going to use porphyritic as an adjective in front of a rock's coarse-grained or fine-grained name. That's as far as we need to go in this class. And so what I mean is if we have a rhyolite, we might call it a porphyritic rhyolite. Or if we have a granite, we might call it a porphyritic granite, if it has large and small crystals. I'll explain more as we look at some of these rocks. Going on to where your lab describes texture, I want to make sure you're clear on what I expect you to use for terms. Here on page 85, your lab suggests phaneritic. Again, I'm happy if you use the term coarse-grained. Aphanitic, you can use fine-grained. Glassy and glassy, that's the same. But then when we get to this word porphyritic, remember that means two different sizes. They suggest one of two names, and I do as well, but I don't like these names that are here. I think they're really way too confusing. So instead of porphyrophaneritic, I would like you to just say porphyritic coarse-grained. And what that means is you've got a coarse-grained rock with two different size populations. Some are much bigger, some are much smaller. And instead of this porphyroaphanitic, you've got porphyritic fine-grained. So you've got a fine-grained rock with some large crystals in it. These are a more subtle way of identifying rocks. These are the three main categories I want you to focus on. We're not going to worry about pyroclastic rocks. Those are related to eruptive sequences from volcanoes that have rocks in them and ash and pumice and other things that we just don't have time to talk about. In terms of these special textures right here, the only one I want you to worry about is vesicles. These are what look like frozen gas bubbles in a rock, and those are in fact gas bubbles that were in the rock when it was molten, and they've kind of been preserved. They look like holes in the rock. So if you have a PCC rock kit, you should pull out the igneous rocks, and I mentioned these in a previous video, but this is the baggie that has rocks that have names with the letter I at the beginning. There's I1, I4, I7. They don't go in order because they match up with the rocks in the main lab, and we don't have one for every rock. But for your kit, we have these 9 rocks. And so what I'd like you to do is take them out, place them on the table, and place them into these different piles. Make a coarse-grained pile. Okay, so those are the ones where you can see the crystals quite visibly. Make a fine-grained pile, those where you can't see the crystals very clearly. They're very tiny. A glassy pile, see if you can see something that looks glassy. And then let's have a pile where you're just not sure, and that's fine. Go ahead and pause the video and try to do this. Okay, so here are the answers. The coarse-grained rocks include these 4 up here, and it's hard to see the numbers in the photo, but these are numbers I1, I9, I17, and I23, and I left out the I's just for simplicity. Now, I think number 1 and 17 are pretty clearly coarse-grained. I9 is pretty tricky because even though it's coarse-grained, the minerals are all pretty much the same color, so you have to be pretty careful when you look at that. I23 might look fine-grained, but these little white minerals here, these little white specks are actually minerals that you can see. So you may in this case need to get out your hand lens, and remember, you want to bring that hand lens right up to your eye and hold that mineral right up there up until it becomes focused and look carefully. And if you can see minerals, then we call that coarse-grained. Okay, the fine-grained were number 4, 10, and 20. The glass was number 7. And then 21 was a crazy one. I'm going to show you a little bit about this one. Now, if you look at number 21, at least the one I have, it's vesicular. Okay, so these are the vesicles I was talking about. And the material out here is very fine-grained. You can't see individual minerals. It's black. So this out here I would call fine-grained. But if you look just at the edge here, there seems to be something different going on. So if we look a little closer, you can see that there are green crystals that look pretty large. If you look even more closely, there are some black crystals in here as well. So this part right here is actually coarse-grained. And these are actually two different rocks that are adjacent to each other or stuck to each other, and I'll explain them later. But the rock that we want you to look at for lab is this part right here, not this part. So this would be fine-grained, but this part here is coarse-grained. And here's another look at it. Mostly this green mineral is olive green, which should give you a hint as to what it is. So that was all the first bullet. The second bullet has to do with composition, and we want to be able to distinguish felsic and mafic compositions and relate this to mineral composition. If you recall, felsic rocks are rich in silica, potassium, and sodium, and mafic ones are rich in iron, magnesium, and calcium. Minerals without iron and magnesium tend to be felsic, and those with iron and magnesium tend to be mafic. Everything has silica, so we can't really look at silica. In the next video, we'll continue with this idea of composition.